Our event is part of a larger thing that KI here at Georgetown does with universities around the country called Labor Spring, in which we're now in our third year of putting on events on campuses around the country to draw attention to the actions and the activities of the labor movement today, and to bring it onto our campuses and to connect academics and students more closely to the labor movement. Tonight's event is in the spirit of that. We gather at an unusual time. This is the 100th day of the administration of Donald Trump, which has certainly been one of the most eventful 100 days of any presidential administration ever. Although I think we're all in agreement tonight, not in a very good way. I think it's appropriate that tonight what we're here to do is not talk about Donald Trump, not focus on the distraction that he is so often, but instead to talk about working people and the labor movement and the role that they can play to meet this moment, to resist some of the things that are going on that so many of us object to. And that's what we're here to talk about tonight. So this event is entitled No Time for Caution, How Labor Should Meet the Moment, this moment. I also want to thank Alex Hahn and the folks at In These Times for being a co-sponsor of tonight's event. So what we're going to do tonight is have a discussion that's been instigated by Stephen Lerner in a recent piece that he did in These Times, in which he said, caution at this time will be fatal for the labor movement if it doesn't respond. And we'll have an open-ended discussion with three panelists, I think, who really are deeply grounded not only in what's going on today in and around labor, but have studied labor and the labor movement in various ways. And they can bring their own scholarly perspectives to bear along with the activist experiences that each of them have had. So let me say first that let me first introduce folks to you who will be speaking tonight. I'll do this really briefly. First, introduce Stephen Lerner. And Stephen is a veteran organizer who has had now almost 50 years, I think, of experience in and around the labor movement in a wide range of unions over the years, the ILG, CWA, the building trades unions, the AFL-CIO, and of course, the Service Employees International Union, where during his tenure, he became the national architect of the Justice for Janitors campaign, perhaps the most successful campaign of the labor movement in the late 20th and early 21st century, certainly one of the most successful in organizing especially immigrant workers. We'll hear first from Stephen, and then we'll go to Will Jones. Will is professor of history at the University of Minnesota. He's an expert on that aspect of U.S. labor history that concerns the intersection of race and class. He's published books on African American industrial workers, and on the March on Washington movement that culminated in 1963. He's currently writing the history or a history of race and inequality in public employment. Will is also past president of LAWCHA, the Labor and Working Class History Association. After we hear from Will, we'll hear from Stephanie Luce. Stephanie is professor of labor studies at the School of Labor and Urban Studies at CUNY. She's also professor of sociology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, CUNY. She's the author of multiple books, best known for her work on the living wage and its struggles for it and its impact. She's also the author of Labor Movements, Global Perspectives, and her latest book is one that I'm sure many of you know, co-authored with Deepak Bhargava, is Practical Radicals, 7 Strategies to Change the World. After we hear from Stephanie, we'll go to Gabe Winant. Gabe is an associate professor of history at the University of Chicago. He's best known for his book, The Next Shift, The Fall of Manufacturing and the Rise of Healthcare in Rust Belt America, a book that won many awards, one that focuses on the transition from an industrial economy to a service-related economy, especially looking at Pittsburgh's transformation from a steelmaking to a medical center town, and looking at its impact on workers. Gabe has written widely for popular publications like Dissent, Jacobin, N+1. He was also co-host of a podcast on the history of the industrial union movement, the CIO, a podcast called Fragile Juggernaut, which was produced by Haymarket Books. So it's a remarkable group that we have before us tonight to engage in this discussion. And to get us started, I wanted to first toss it to you, Stephen, to outline for folks who might not have read it or read it when it appeared, the article that you talked about, the idea behind it. And this was an article that was published about a month ago, got a lot of attention, a lot of discussion going, which is what led to tonight's event. And, some stuff has happened over the past month. So love to hear, what you think of recent events of the past month in light of what you were saying then, and just bring people up to speed on your thinking on this.
Yep. Thanks, Joe. And I also want to thank Will and Stephanie and the many people who this article went through many drafts and was really in many ways a thinking aloud with many people about what we should do. So I want to thank everybody who helped in writing it. In some ways, the title of it, which is, that for labor caution may be fatal, the biggest risk is staying the course, or that may be the exact title, in some ways captures what the article's about, and also my 50 years of life in the labor movement, which is almost everything that we try to do that's different or whatever, we hear it's too risky, it's too risky. And we end up in this sort of silly debate about what level of risk we should take. And I guess sort of the core idea here is the greatest risk for unions and for this country and for workers is to stay the course and do more of the same. And that may not sound like a particularly profound idea, but it's a total change from the notion that we should take a risk because maybe that will produce a good result. If we don't take a risk, we'll have horrible results. And I've then had all these conversations with people since it came out, and I just want to touch on a couple things that people talked about that seem to really capture their attention as a way to set this up. And one of the first things that the article talks about is there's been terrible repression since the 1870s of unions. And I'm not going to go through the details of troops and deportations, but we overcame it and won. And a lot of people commented on they don't know that history, that it was really good to know that we faced horrible, in many cases, worse things in the past than we face now. And that understanding that history teaches us valuable lessons of the kind of things we have to do. The IWW filled jails around free speech. There's a lot of lessons in that. And then the second thing that really, I think, got pulled out, and Will was very helpful in this, is that we don't need to go to Hungary or Europe or talk about fascist Italy or Spain to imagine where our future is going. The Jim Crow segregated South is in many ways American fascism that existed. And that's where we're going for the whole country. Again, I'm not going to go into the details, but I think it's really helpful to understand not only is this not new for labor, it's not new in this country to have this kind of repression. And that understanding that, and also what the liberation struggle was that led to defeating Jim Crow and segregation in the South, again, offers valuable lessons on this. And the other thing that I think some people that the article covers and that some people I think haven't fully grasped necessarily is there's one view that the whole Trump and his billionaire buddies are just about getting richer. But there's something else going on, which is a Silicon Valley sort of techno-fascists who openly say that we need a CEO, monarch, dictator to run the country. This is not fantasy. This is what they believe. And as you see Elon Musk scooping up all of our data and everything, that there's something bigger than just getting more wealth. They want total control of all parts of our society. And those are all things that are happening. And so understanding all that then compels us to act and not be neutral or not be afraid to take risk. That would be the biggest risk. And I guess what I'd end with, just as an intro, is what's been so exciting, because I think we started off this year with very little happening and with much of the labor movement feeling immobilized. And a bunch of us, including Stephanie and anyway, we were in Chicago a month ago at a convening that was called by the Chicago Teachers Union, by Bargaining for Common Good, Midwest Academy, and other people. And we had 200 people there. And we had this crazy idea, could we do 100 cities on May Day? And this thing has just taken off. The latest numbers are that we have, I think, 1,300 events on May Day, 800 different cities, ranging from strikes to all sorts of creative activity. And there's sort of an excitement and an urgency. People are ready to get into action. And that's the other thing I talk about in the paper. In the article, we are far from powerless here. We've shut down cities in the past. We've shut down Silicon Valley. We've done strikes. We've done all of these kinds of things. So really what the article is calling for is to look at our history, gather the best things that we know how to do, and to get in the goddamn fight and not sit down passively and hope it by not poking the bear that we'll be okay. So I actually am feeling sort of fired up and optimistic right now because I see so much good stuff developing. And I'm really interested in hearing what everybody else in the panel has to say and everything about what they think we can do, where we can go. And this is it, folks. This is deciding our future. So it's all being decided on this call tonight. I'll pass that back to you, Joe.
Thank you, Stephen, for getting us going. Will, what would you like to say?
It puts a high bar. We have to solve it all tonight. Um, well, thanks, Joe and Alexis, for organizing this. And I'm really honored to be part of this conversation with Stephen and Stephanie and Gabe, and all of everybody who showed up. I totally, I read this article before and am really excited by it, and I totally agree with a lot of what Stephen has to say. I think, clearly we've been in similar situations before, and we can learn from those lessons in the 1880s, the 19 teens and 20s, the 1950s and 1960s, and take lessons from that history in terms of both the need for mass mobilization and the need for risk taking. I completely agree with Stephen's action plan about building new infrastructure for mobilization, the coordination of across unions. He points to the model of Minnesota, where I live, where a coalition of unions and worker centers, faith organizations, housing groups, immigrant rights organizations, has taken a really broad approach to organizing and mobilizing, and I think made a huge impact on our community and our state, and I think an impact on the nation. The focus on key economic centers, healthcare, higher education, airports, K-12, logistics and manufacturing, and the ability to mobilize within those sectors to expand rights and to take action. This has worked in the past, and I think it can work in the present. I wanted to just raise a few items of emphasis that I would shift some emphasis. I think throughout the essay, I would have put a lot more attention on the need for organization. So Stephen emphasizes decentralized, distributed organizing. I think we need more than that. I think we need democratic organizations that can identify processes or priorities through a democratic process, be accountable to their members. This cannot be a movement of isolated, sort of individualized radicals, but it needs to be something that in which people have organizations that they can make decisions in a democratic process. This means that unions and mass organizations need to be far bigger than they currently are. We can talk about the labor movement all we want, but if it represents less than 10% of the workforce, it's really a powerless force. I think the US left tends to be far too romantic about decentralized leadership movements, and I think that's gotten in a lot of trouble, and I think we need to come out of that. Um, I think there are a few cases where this is successful, and I would actually point to alternative narratives that in which organizations that have been very centralized have been very effective. So Stephen points to the IWW in the early 20th century. I would actually point to the American Federation of Labor, which was by far the most durable and influential labor organization that we've ever seen in the history of the United States. It emerged from the backlash of the 1880s and lasts to this day. And I think there are a lot of reasons for this. It's a very complicated history, but I would point out that the largest unions that we have today still, including SEIU, the AFT, the Teamsters, are all originated in the AFL. That does not mean that the AFL had a model that I think we necessarily want to replicate. It was far too conservative. It was explicitly racist and sexist and exclusionary of immigrants. But I think we need to look at the model of organization and think about the importance of having durable institutions. I would actually make a similar argument about the 1960s when Stephen points to SNCC. I would point to far larger, and far more durable civil rights organizations, the NAACP, the National Council of Negro Women, the Negro American Labor Council, which became the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. And I think that we need to pay attention to the importance of the very difficult work and hard work of organizing. I know that this is not a surprise to Stephen. He knows about this. I'll just close by pointing out that when I finished my book on the March on Washington, I sent it to my editor. He read it. He said, this is great, but are you actually going to write about the march? And I realized that I hadn't actually written anything about the march. Basically, it's a study of the 20 years that preceded the march and how people actually got to the position where they could organize a March on Washington. I added a chapter on the March on Washington, but I will concede that it's not the most important part of the book. So I'll end there. Thank you for this conversation. I look forward to continuing.
Wonderful, Will. Thank you very much. You put a lot of good thoughts on the table there that we'll have a chance to return to. Let's go to you, Stephanie.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for inviting me, and it's great to be part of this panel. Stephen's article was super useful, and so I felt like I have nothing to add to, he said it all there, but I think really just, again, emphasizing some of the key points. I think what we're looking at is this moment in which we might see, hopefully, what my late dear friend Dan Clausen talked about, a labor upsurge. We know from history in the US and in other countries that there are these moments when labor power grows exponentially, not linearly. And we don't know, will there ever be another labor upsurge? We don't know, but what we're doing right now is doing the best to anticipate that and make the most of when that moment happens. And so I think, a lot of what Stephen's arguing for is we need sharper research, we need to be building infrastructure and looking for places to generate that and stimulate that upsurge, but we can also be thinking about how to take advantage of openings that we know are going to arise. The next climate disaster, sliding into recession, a lot of bad things are destined to come our way, and are we also suited to take advantage of those openings when they arise to drive wedges in the MAGA coalition, in the Trump coalition? And so I think what it means to prepare for an upsurge moment is, some of the stuff that Stephen talks about, people being trained around civil disobedience and trained around leadership. But what we should especially be doing is anticipating the kinds of things we know always happen in upsurge moments or in left politics, which is there will be conflict internally. That always happens. It's not a bad thing. Conflict can be generative, but we need people skilled and trained to anticipate it and ideally navigate it, how to navigate united front politics. A lot of people are coming in new to politics. They don't know how this operates. So we should anticipate that, and that should be part of our orientation. We also need to be inoculating against the attacks we know that will come from the outside. the employers that try to drive wedges in our power, the police that try and infiltrate, the different ways that opponents use carrots and sticks to try and drive wedges in our solidarity and keep us apart, and peel off pieces of the coalition. And so I think we need to be inoculating, preparing for that, doing scenario training, whatever it might be, but thinking of our leadership as very skilled in that way. And then just returning again and again to our base of power, which is our solidarity. To any time that we're seeing places where they're trying to pick us apart, private sector versus public sector, red state versus blue state, even party versus party, our strength is our solidarity, and we have to return to that as a basic principle. And for there, I would lift up one piece that I think could be stronger, which is our internationalist orientation. And the labor movement has historically been at strength when it had a more international orientation. And I think we're at our weakest that we've been in a long time right now. And they are trying to take advantage of that. The authoritarian coalition is an international movement. Our movements are really suffering right now, and we're on the defense, and we're weak. We have a weakness towards nationalism. If we return to nationalist responses, we will lose. The working class never succeeds with a nationalist response. And so I think, this is a matter of even sometimes just framing. We're not just defending people deported unfairly or people deported because they were good. We're defending everyone in this case. We're returning to an international vision of a labor movement and an international working class. And so I just will end with another piece of exciting news today. 12 unions launched something called Labor for Democracy. I think that will be an expanding network over the coming days. And they have a very much of an internationalist pro-democracy agenda. And so that's another point of excitement for the direction of where we're headed. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephanie. We'll come back to that formation that was announced today as the discussion goes on. Gabe, let's turn to you.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Thanks, Stephen. I'm really glad to be here with you all, and honored to see all the people whom I admire in the attendees list. There's many who I've learned so much from who are here. So I'll just say a kind of few related things. I thought about reading Stephen's essay, and really at that event in Chicago, where several of us were. But this is really in particular drawing on my current kind of activity in the academic labor movement. One, it seems to me that right now, actually, we are surrounded in our workplaces and communities by people who are scared, and because they're scared, they want to join something. That is more true now than any moment in my time in the labor movement. And it's our job to take that fear and turn it from paralysis into activity. Once someone is active, once they're unfrozen, fear starts to change and its kind of emotional character and gradually turns into optimism, right? Which is the kind of alchemy that we need to help people kind of go through. So to do that, I think we need to give people in our workplaces, in our communities, in our unions, in our organizations, things to join which link them to a larger set of struggles. So not skipping over the kind of proximate local fights, but rather identifying the possible fights that connect the local and the metropolitan, the national, and the international when possible. The way to do that is to identify shared targets, right? That we, in our own workplaces, in our own unions, in our own communities, would have a real reason to want to fight with, that someone else whom we want to be connected to would also want to fight with. I think that the current techno-fascist, billionaire, oligarchic class is actually a target-rich environment in that respect. 3, as we start to build the coalitions that can attack those targets from multiple related directions, we have to do real work to make those coalitions cohesive, right? So it can't just be the kind of instrumental transactional relationship in which, we have a common enemy, we'll turn out to an event together, whatever. We have to actually do real, I think, intellectual work to start to spell out what it is that we have in common in a deeper and more lasting way. In higher ed with K through 12 teachers and with healthcare workers and with federal workers, right? These are some of the proximate sectors where I think we can identify common enemies and then figure out how to attack those enemies together. But then once we do that, we actually have to start to tell a story together about how we're united by something more than just that enemy. And that leads me to a kind of final point, which is that in those struggles, we have to take them as opportunities to generate not just a defensive vision, and we're on the defensive now, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise, but to generate not just a defensive vision, but a proactive and transformative one. The struggle to defend our democracy, the defensive struggle that we're going to have to fight for the next few months, at some point is going to have to become a struggle for the democratization of our society, which is a different question, a related one, but a different one. And we have to survive long enough to get the chance to do that. But if we survive long enough, I think, and that's a question of a year, 2 years, at some point, the contradictions of the Trump regime are going to escalate. There will be some major crisis, and the opportunity to take the initiative will pass into our hands, I think. And when that happens, we have to have done this work of cohering with one another that already has to have been accomplished to some degree. And that cohesion, the results from that, has to have in it an idea of how we can democratize our school systems, our healthcare systems, our universities, our cities, our unions, and the Democratic Party, which is not going to help us do this. Resistance 1.0 was led by the liberal establishment, and this time they're paralyzed and running for the hills, and we have to lead. And that's an opportunity. It's a moment of danger because it means we're more exposed. We don't have the same coalition partners we used to have, but it's also an opportunity. So to wrap up, I do think it's worth really saying, and I was glad that Stephen made the point about techno-fascism. Our opponents want to liquidate us. Mark Andreessen, who's one of these tech industry guys, was saying today, I think actually the only job that couldn't be replaced by AI is venture capitalist. They think we are all disposable, and I think we should take disposability in its worst possible meaning as potentially, on the table. But facing that fact, I think gives our coworkers, our community members, our colleagues, our comrades a chance to articulate why we're valuable, what it is that we do in the society, what the contribution we make, the meaning of that contribution, and that in creating opportunities for that to be asserted, I think we will begin to create a genuinely new vision of democracy.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much, Gabe. Well, Stephen, this is the kind of intelligent discussion that your article has stirred. Let's just hear from you before we start to just mix it up all together. Anything strike you about some of these comments?
Well, one, I agree with a lot of them. I'll come back to a second on the question of centralization. But one of the things that it really got me thinking about, and which I talk about in the article, and which is the project we're now on, is so in addition to mass mobilization and trainings, who are the targets? What do we do? And what we're thinking a lot about is how we look at the different sectors of the economy, which I won't relist because Gabe just listed them. And then who are the bad guys there? And then how do we go after them? But how do we go after their money in a way that does a lot of what people talked about, which is not just that they're a bad guy, but all the other. So I'll give an example. Blackstone, some of you may have heard of it. It's, a giant private equity company, a huge giver to Trump. Blackstone, there's a big article in the paper, is now the largest landlord in Spain, doing mass evictions there. And they get a significant amount of their capital from public employment pension plans. Many of the techno-fascists, Mark Andreessen, Thiel, Plant, all these companies, they're funded with workers' money. And, just as Tesla is funded with workers' money and with tax breaks all over the country. So one of the things that we're starting to focus on, and, there's going to be more and more on, what's the map of the bad guys? Where do they get their money? How are they susceptible? Tesla, I was very suspicious that we could do anything that would impact Musk on the front end because he's the richest guy in the world. And he's been devastated by the activity. So I think one of the key things we need to think about is who are the players by sector, by geography, and then especially in the public sector, we have to realize that the bad guys are not necessarily the government entities that are being bankrupted, but it's the corporations that are bankrupting them. And so we have to be very careful that we don't just get in a pissing match with politicians over a lack of funding, that we need to go after the folks that are actually sponsoring the defunding. And so with AAUP and other higher ed unions, we've already been doing work that some folks here involved, is who are on the boards of the universities that are in the Trump-Musk universe who are defunding the very universities they're on the boards are. How do we find things that connect directly to people's lives so it's not abstract? I don't think we're going to move people, to be honest, all over the country in techno-fascism, but we will move them on the issue that these guys want to eliminate every benefit you have, that they want to destroy your union. And so I think, one, I totally agree on the internationalist question, and that becomes really important. And I think this question of focusing on different sectors as both how we organize workers, both currently union and should be union, and then how within those sectors we understand where they get their capital and how they do things. And then ultimately, how do we have potentially the most disruptive effect we can have? 7-1, which is the SEIU local in LA, struck last year for a day an accident, and they shut down the port because they had some inspectors. I'm not sure who they had it. We need to think also about how we disrupt the economy in the biggest way, because ultimately the way we're going to stop this from happening is to cause a split in the ruling class. Already the finance class is upset with the other folks over tariffs. So we have to figure out how we focus and how we split them. And those are all things that I think people are excited about. And there's going to be lots of things that people can do, like Tesla takedown around these. And then, Will, I guess my one question for you, and my fear here is, one, that I think we're heading for a serious, serious time of repression. So when I talk about decentralization, it is not romantic at all. I mean, I come out of the executive board of a national union. It is based on my fear that if we house this too much in traditional organizations, that they will not stand up to the level of oppression we're facing. So I'm all for working with them, I'm for engaging them, but I think we need to get ourselves ready and be honest for what's, not honest, but really deal with what's coming. And if we base this in unions, the national leadership alone, they will get indicted. Things will happen to them. And we then need to have a plan about how we're proceeding if they're trying to split us and indicting folks. So I just think the seriousness of this moment requires us to think about what do we do immediately, and then how do we do that immediately in splitting the ruling groups in a way that does everything that you all talked about in terms of long-term organization. But I am like focused, the next 3 months are going to be decisive. And if we can't do dramatic things in these 3 months, I'm not sure we're going to have in the short run the capacity to do the kind of rebuilding we do. And just on this one thing that just popped up, I think many of us just have made the assumption that we and other folks may go to jail. So we need to figure out the lane that we're all comfortable in. That's not a call that everybody has to do that. Some of us have to be willing to do that and are. Other folks will support in other ways, but we really are facing authoritarian and fascism, whatever you want to call it. So I think we need to build organizations that can rise to that moment and operate under that. But I'll pass it back to you, Joe, however you want to do it.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, well, Will, do you want to pick up on that part of the thread?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think you're right that about the need for alternatives to organizations that, in the face of repression. I mean, actually, the SNCC and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference were created in the South because the NAACP was banned in Alabama and a bunch of Southern states and couldn't operate. But that didn't mean that the NAACP disappeared and didn't play an important role, continuing to represent people in courts and to get people and to bail people out. And so, I mean, I don't think I think it's true that, we have to be prepared for repression, but we shouldn't dissolve or ignore our organizations before they're repressed.
Nor am I arguing that.
They become really critical. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess I would also say that I think there's a democratic nature of organizations that allows the members of those organizations to inform the leadership and to inform the agenda of that organization in ways that is very difficult in a decentralized movement. And I think decentralized movements privilege people who are the most vocal and the most active, and they set the agenda. And that's really different from a mass organization that is genuinely, I mean, there are certainly undemocratic mass organizations, and we need to fix that. But I think the hard work of organizing and building institutions that people can actually see their agendas realized, I think is really important and needs to be done. And it's difficult and it takes a lot of work.
Stephanie, maybe this pertains a bit to what you were talking about in terms of there will be internal tensions and conflicts in the movement. Could you say more about what you're thinking about in that way? And, you said we have to be prepared to sort of reconcile these tensions. How do you see that playing out in this kind of discussion?
Well, directly related to this point, I think it's also true that these large national organizations are slow and clunky and bureaucratic. Making decisions takes a long time. They should find a way around that. But in the meantime, we can't wait for them. And the upsurges and these moments come not necessarily because of the top leaders, but in spite of them. And so I think what we often see is that it's still leaders of organizations, but more likely at the local level, big locals. Chicago Teachers is the one that's really pushed around this May Day organizing. UFCW 3000 has pushed around labor for ceasefire and labor for democracy. And so it may be organizational leadership that is more nimble and more ready to respond. And so you have this kind of, you have grassroots pressure from the rank and file, but you have local leaders that are willing to move and strategize, and then pushing leadership from above. That doesn't let the national leadership off the hook. But I think the other kinds of tensions are just people remembering that the labor movement is not, we didn't join the unions because we're all on the same page politically. We have a lot of difference about politics within our unions that we have to navigate, but our power is in our numbers. And so we're not looking to shrink to the smallest number of people that unite around every single demand. We're looking to bring in a big movement and figure out how to work together across our memberships, across sector, and then with non-union workers and community organizations. And so I think in addition to the role that local leaders can play, union local leaders can play in this moment, we also need bridge builders that have the ability to navigate between the union context, which is really often confusing and alienating, with community organizations and social movement groups. And part of also what I'm thinking is a lot of times when we're in these coalitions, unions have more power, they can cut a deal and break out of the coalition. And so we need to be realistic about that and upfront about that dynamic that often happens, and try to find ways that it's not always the most marginal that's getting cut off first, but that we are, sticking again to solidarity principles.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Gabe, you talked about, sticking with the theme maybe of democracy for a bit, that the initial fight is about defense of democracy, but it needs to move to democratizing our society. And you also mentioned our unions. So how do you see wrestling with the tension of centralization, democracy, and the initial phase of this fight and what you see down the line?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had an easy answer for it. It seems to me like in the current moment, following on what Stephanie said, there's going to be a lot of initiative kind of from below, and we have to hope for that. That's a good thing. In unions and in other kinds of social movements to start to rally around individually targeted people or institutions that have been are coming under specific attack in one kind or another. Right, deportation fights, huge budget cuts, mass layoffs, these kinds of things. And we're seeing that happen. I think, the Federal Unionist Network is a good example of this, actually, right? That this organization that was begun to be built under the Biden administration to lobby Biden around certain federal employment issues, and spans across the different federal unions. And so it's sort of more nimble, right? Has actually kind of been out front, and more, I think it's fair to say, more nimble than the existing unions that represent federal employees at their national level. I think the challenge is going to come in deciding when and how to escalate. Right, there are going to be many moments in many targeted sectors of society where the threat to a particular individual or institution feels really significant and potentially kind of fatal in one form or another. And so people in the kind of immediate radius of that fight are going to want to escalate really rapidly. And, the question that will then arise is, has enough been built around them for others to kind of escalate with them, or will they overexpose themselves or overexpose others who might come with them in such an escalation? And I think trying to get the timing of that right is going to be the central question. And it seems to me, so someone said at this same meeting we were talking about, that we should expect, and in some ways we should even hope for a major national crisis, on the order of the 2020 George Floyd uprising, or even more so, sometime during the Trump administration, because of a defiance of the Supreme Court, shooting protesters. I mean, you can imagine the scenarios. And if it comes too soon, that's a disaster because we're not ready. And if it comes too late, that's a disaster because it means we've already lost.
Mm.
And so trying to get the timing of that right, I think, is a question about how these kind of initiatives from below relate to the kind of larger coalition dynamic. And I mean, I agree with Will in principle that it would be great to have democratic organization by which we can actually deliberate and make decisions together, and we should build that as much as we can. But I also think, frankly, whatever we build is going to be so insufficient to actually the kind of coordination that's going to need to happen, which is going to inevitably have a spontaneous quality and therefore be chaotic and get people into situations they didn't plan on. I don't relish that. I just think that's the reality.
Mhm. Anybody want to respond to that?
Yeah, one thing I just throw in that that's come up, which is I agree on the idea that it's local community groups and labor unions. Like what we've already seen around the May Day stuff is it was local unions that primarily and community groups that sponsored that event. And then it's brought many internationals along. And so I don't think, I mean, I have, for folks who don't know me, I spent most of my life in the national union bureaucracy and both as an executive board member, et cetera, et cetera. And everything Stephanie said about how slow, we don't have time to go to the executive boards and the presidents and have a debate. What actually moves most unions is when their key locals start doing stuff and making it happen. And that's sort of where many of us are focusing our activity. And again, as part of bargaining for common good, which is where I am now, it's how does labor and community have a different kind of relationship, not where the union dictates. And that's what's happened in Minnesota, that Will talked about when they did their week of action and their strikes. So I think this question of starting from the bottom and how we build stuff that way, that then will move national unions. And I think FUN is a good Federal Unionist Network is a good example of that. Let's be honest, the federal unions were not going to lead this, but they've managed to find the sweet spot of being in partnership with their federal unions that exist, but pulling people together in a way that lets them move different kind of activities. Somebody in the chat, I can't keep up with the chat, so I apologize to folks who are saying, why don't you talk about this and that? Because my brain doesn't work fast enough to read those, listen to this and comment. But somebody did say, what about, why the next 3 months? Because I think Trump is moving so quickly in both dismantling unions, going after universities, everything, that if we don't show an ability to fight back and demonstrate real strength and power, that we're just going to get rolled over, and it's much, much harder to rebuild from that. And that we are in a position where we can do things now, and that we need to sort of build it out quickly. And I too have the nervousness of the timing and do we get too militant too quickly or not? But I think we need to accept that this is not a traditional union campaign where you can sort of say, well, it's 6 months until the contract expires, that this is going to move very, very quickly. And the word a couple people used is nimble, that we need to be nimble, we need to be creative. And I am also, and I talk a lot about it in the article, unions, except at the critical moment of the crisis, are just incredibly conservative. They have pension funds, they have members, and I don't necessarily disagree that if you're the head of a union, you're thinking about all those things. I think we need to build out from the bottom the kind of excitement and energy that will then give people the courage to do things that they don't currently have the courage or the willingness to do.
Can I just add something?
Jump in.
Just to clarify, I'm not talking about national unions being the leader of anything. I'm saying that at the local level, if we want to
Yes.
have any power, we need
Totally.
to have unions that are representing exponentially more people than they are doing now. And and that's what we need to be building. I think, I mean, I think I would point people to the in these times piece on labor organizers of the year. And this is the kind of work that people need to be doing. Antonio Rosario working with the Teamsters to organize Amazon warehouses, an anonymous immigrant rights worker in the South who remained anonymous because she fears repression. But she's organizing immigrant workers in the South. Catherine Paisley, who's working with Beyond Bars, a member-led worker center for people with criminal records and their families. These are the types of organizing that I'm talking about. The Starbucks workers, right? That didn't start at the national level. That started in individual stores and it spread out there. But they built organizations. The academic workers this is remarkable. I mean, I'm at a university. I didn't know this, that 6 universities won their first contract with the United Electrical Workers, covering 18,000 graduate workers over the past year, including at the university where I work, the University of Minnesota. We passed reforms, facilitating collective bargaining for about 23,000 workers at the University of Minnesota, and I think that's what I'm talking about. So I'm not talking about the national unions taking this, but I think we need this is the infrastructure that we need, and we better build it quickly.
Mhm. Stephanie or Gabe?
Well, one thing I think the other challenge of this time, we're throwing all kinds of challenges out there, but it's a moment where we have to be on the defense. Absolutely, the attacks are coming from all sides. But I think what Stephen's article is also talking about, taking big risks, is also it's sticking to a big vision too, because that's what keeps a lot of people in the struggle. And as long as we're just defense, 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 we will lose. We have to take a step back as well and think offensively. And that's why I think the call for the May 1, 2028 strike is, that's maybe too far off. Maybe we won't even be able to strike them, but it's a way to think long term and start thinking about what would it take to build the power we need to get there. What are the steps? How does this fit together? How do we begin to think up from going from defense to offense? Because that's what the opponents have done. They've been really good at that and saying we're willing to take some short-term losses, or we know we're going to lose in the short term, but hopefully those are losses that build capacity and make possible other opportunities. And so if to the extent that we can create that space where we're balancing both things, we're fighting long-term because 2028 is going to happen. We may be fighting just to have an election. We may be fighting to push the Democratic Party's primaries to a certain direction. We're going to need to engage in some way. And so we need to be building for that as well as tomorrow. We need to be building, right now.
Thanks, Stephanie. Anybody want to follow on that?
Just in glancing at the chat, people, and I'm missing most of it, I apologize, but we're definitely, lots of groups are talking about how do we do trainings on civil disobedience and non-compliance, and how do we do that both locally on Zoom. There's going to be some really good stuff coming out, again, as I said earlier, on who the oligarchs are, who the bad guys are. There's going to be a whole set of websites coming out soon that will sort of name them. And I think one of the things that we really have to work on is we often think that saying bad things about them is how we're going to move them. And these folks don't care if we say they're terrible people. They're pretty much honest that they're terrible people. I mean, the whole Silicon Valley crew that says empathy is bad, that's a sign of human weakness or something. So I think this question of how we actually cost them money is really critical. That this is not we're not going to change them by a moral argument that they're bad people. They want to make as much money as they can. They want to do so. This question of digging in, and I even think the May Day slogan is, this is for workers, not billionaires. That this is a time, and this is also how we go on offense, and how we often start to sharpen what we want to win by being clear that this is an attack of the richest people and the biggest companies on multiple different levels. And so I think that is really key to get people focused on. It's billionaires, it's those people, and many of them have many weaknesses that we can take advantage of, and also that there's huge contradictions. Just as during the time of the CIO, there was a difference between how manufacturers thought about the economy and how banks and retail. There's real differences among the ruling class. And part of our job has to be to toxify the bad guys, to split the ruling class, which then opens a door to do everything that we're talking about in terms of fighting for the world we want. And I do think, on what everybody's saying, we should never have a meeting, we should never write anything, we should never do anything where we are not adding in that we are fighting for a different and better world. Because if people think this is about going backwards to what we used to have, or a defensive fight to go back to the intolerable, that just lays the groundwork for the next MAGA movement. It has to be about what is it that we want, what are the ways we win it, who stands in the way of us getting there, and what are the kind of actions that we need to individually and collectively take to have an opportunity to do that. And as I said earlier, I both operate under terror of what they can do, but with extraordinary hope that this is going to be something that's going to drive us to do things we've been afraid to do, that need to be done, that's going to allow us not just to rebuild the labor movement, but to transform this country and the world and take it away from these guys.
Thanks, Stephen. I think the last time that the labor movement wrestled with questions this big, this urgent, was the time of the Great Depression. And you just alluded, Stephen, to the divisions that existed among factions of capital then. Gabe, you've been part of a massive, podcast, Fragile Juggernaut, where you really sorted through that crisis and how the labor movement capitalized on it. What have you been thinking about lately regarding what kinds of things we should be thinking about and lessons from that period?
Yeah. Well, let me say, I think Stephen is totally right to emphasize the contradictions in Trump's coalition, right? That is a crucial lesson from that period, one that we often skip over in the heroics of the CIO, right? That the division in capital was of decisive importance, in fact, to the possibility of the New Deal. And I think, we all kind of know there are contradictions in the Trump project, but it's worth trying to actually spell them out further, right? There's the tension that we have seen playing out over tariffs and over immigration in different ways between, on one side, Besant and these kinds of guys who represent kind of a more traditional Wall Street group. On the other side, some of the kind of more like maniac tech guys. I also think that, to be honest, and this is going to sound academic, but I think it's important to say, our enemies in power have a really bad theory of how the world works, right? They actually think and I think that's significant. You can win with bad theory. They have so far, but it also can cause you to lose. And that's in particular, they think that what Musk calls the woke mind virus, right? It's like, in other words, people's desire to be free has spread by just kind of some process of infection, right? Contagion. This is their account of it. Right, we're indoctrinating it in the schools and whatever. And for that reason, they actually, I think, genuinely do not understand the sources of the energy that they've been in different kinds of liberation struggles on the left over the past generation and into the present. I actually think they don't get where it comes from. Now, that doesn't mean they can't win, but I think that it does mean they can't actually turn it off in the way that they believe that they can, and they'll be continually surprised to see it bubble back up again. Our job, then, I think, is to take some of the energies whose sources are actually obscure to our enemies and reveal how far they actually reach, right? The Starbucks fight is a good example of this. The Starbucks fight has been heavily informed by struggles for trans liberation, right? That's been a huge part of what has mobilized Starbucks workers. That's a connection between what, Musk or Vance or Trump or whatever sees as like a kind of weird cultural virus indoctrinating students and a massive labor struggle. I think we could, I don't want to belabor it, but I think we could name many, many other connections like that. And as we bring them out, I think we will expose the weakness of the regime's understanding of us, right? Even as we kind of activate the misunderstandings among them and the contradictions and conflicts among them. So that's it's not exactly about the 30s, I'm sorry, but I guess that's one way of thinking about it.
No, that's great. Anybody want to follow on that?
I only listen to historians. I'm not a historian, so I'm not going to weigh in any more deeply on this.
Well, you dialogued well with them, Stephen. Well, maybe this is a good point to to pick out a question from the chat. I'm curious. Let me see if I can find the one I was looking for. How can this strategy not include federal and public sector workers, given the dismantling of the state and the rights of public sector unions to collect dues, bargain, and represent workers? This workforce has formed part of the bedrock foundation of the middle class. Gabe and Stephen have both referred to Federal Unionists Network Fund, one part of this fight. Will, you've written a lot and are writing now a lot about public sector workers. And have you given thought to the role that federal workers struggle is playing or needs to play in this? And what kinds of things are you thinking about?
Well, I mean, I think we've seen the importance of big institutions just in the lawsuits against the federal firings and the effort to push back on the collective bargaining retrenchment. I think, these are unions that are very sort of cautious and have not moved very quickly. I think, on the other hand, I would actually point to public sector workers at the local level. I mean, obviously teachers, who have been really for several decades, I think, at the forefront of pushing the sort of the margins of what the labor movement's able to take on, and played, again, here in the Twin Cities and in Chicago, I think played a really important role in sort of building these broader networks of unions that have been really critical at mobilizing a much broader section of the working class. That and also the work that Stephen and Joe are involved in on bargaining for a common good, which is the idea of sort of taking issues that are important to union members and to workers, but also are important to the people that to the public that they work with, and trying to connect those in ways that I think sort of politicize collective bargaining in a way that's has a very expansive outcome. So I would point to those examples.
Thanks, Will. Anybody else want to talk about the role of government?
Well, I was just going to say, in addition to everything Will's saying about it, it really has been public sector workers have been most out front. That there's an interesting, they're taking, DOGE to the states. Texas is already doing it. And so I think the interplay between federal employees, and people should remember that we have a lot of federal employees in DC, but Ogden, Utah has the highest percentage of federal employees in the country. Huntsville, all sorts of red states have lots of federal employees. And so I think, and that the connection between, state and municipal workers and federal workers, and they're seeing how the same things are coming to both of them, is like how fast they've tried to dismantle the federal unions should be a lesson to every private public union. So I think there's a really important potentially cross current there of seeing what's coming, and also helping people see, and I think this has been a theme in the chat, is that we have the same enemies. We have the same folks that want to dismantle at the state and federal level. And there was just a comment, we all know what this is about. It's about massive privatization. In the end, you break the government and then you privatize it. And these guys are all ready to do it. So I think that I think the bigger issue to me, in a way, is I think it's public sector unions that are the most active, is getting more private sector unions, especially private sector unions that play key linchpins in how the economy goes. Airports, it's airports, ports, intermodal. If you want to have strikes that cripple the economy, where you strike is critically important. And so I think this question, we don't think enough sectorally about both how we unite workers by sector, understand who runs the sector, and what its involvement in the overall economy is really critical. And we have to build that all in to what a plan is, because on the one hand, we need lots of people, but you can have millions of people marching. And I think there's a lot of the analysis of fascism, that fascism isn't designed to be popular. They don't care if thousands or millions of people march. They care if the system is disrupted in a way that it means that they lose control. And I think we really need to be focused on that we could bring 5 million people to Washington and they might smile at us. But if we're able to start shutting down parts of the economy at key times and doing those kind of things, that's what's going to fracture the ruling class.
You know, thank you, Stephen, for that. One of the other areas, in addition to federal workers, other government workers that are really on the front lines of this, is that, you know, college and university campuses are really becoming sites of struggle. And I know a number of you are involved in that as activists. And Stephen, I know you're working with different unions rooted in academia. I wonder what you all are seeing in that front, and what hopes do you have, and what obstacles you think are presenting problems at this point. Does anybody want to speak to that?
Go ahead.
You can go, Stephanie.
Well, I would just say, like, I think there's the question of academic workers organizing, which actually is doing relatively well. It's in a strong position. But then there's the question of campus-based student activism, which is in a very deep low. And in part due to sustained attacks from the right for the last decade or 15 years on student organizing and funding of student organizations on campuses, and then the brutal attacks on Palestinian activists in the last year. And so these have left campus-based activism at a really tenuous, difficult time, and people are afraid. And I think this fight back, you know, my hope is to re-engage those who can take risks, take the bigger risks, and protect those that can't take the bigger risks. I'd love to see us come back in the fall semester to do a national teach-in where we're sharing resources around the country to talk about the issues we're facing, not just on campus and freedom of speech and so forth, but, you know, issues facing us in the big picture, as well as concrete, like some of the skills Stephen's talking about as researching your board of trustees, how to engage in cooperation, you know, how to unite student struggles and campus worker, academic worker struggles, which, you know, they can be, and they've done well in other ways. It's just, it's a really tenuous time for student activists.
Yeah, I think that's, oh, sorry, Will, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
That's a very well taken point. I do want to emphasize, I think, how dynamic the academic labor movement is at the moment, though. I mean, I think we should all be extremely grateful that we're coming off of a decade of intense growth in the academic labor movement. Year over year, for I think most of the last 10 years, the biggest new bargaining units, you know, with the winning first contracts and winning first elections have all been on university campuses, basically. Once in a while, a big hospital or a factory, but university campuses have really clearly led the way there. And lots of universities just are wall to wall now. Even, I'll just give you the example of where I worked. I worked at the University of Chicago. You basically could not imagine a more conservative faculty than the faculty of the University of Chicago. But our AAUP chapter has grown more than tenfold over 6 months. And I don't think that's unique. I think the challenge is to, in addition to what Stephanie said, to solidify the relationships between all different organizations on campuses. So again, just to give you my local case, we have AUP, which is non-bargaining because we're a private university. We have the Grad Workers Union. We have the non-tenure track faculty union, which is actually 2 different bargaining units. We have the nurses union at the hospital. We have a Teamsters chapter on campus covering you know, various service functions, but not all of them. We have an SEIU local and security guards or chapter security guards, and I'm forgetting some. There's a committee of interns and residents at the hospital also. So anyway, like that's a big coalition of people in an exciting way, right? But like I've never met anyone from some of those chapters, and I'm very involved in labor politics on my campus. So actually getting those people together, I think we can do it, and I think we are doing it, but I think it's a journey, to say nothing of then the larger question Stephanie raises. Then once you imagine that formation all put together, right? Like here in Chicago, we also need to make sure that's happening at UIC, at Northwestern, at Loyola, at DePaul, right? Like all of those have to happen simultaneously, so that we then have a sectoral organization of all our organizations in higher ed across the whole region, which can then build an alliance with K-12 teachers, right, and with federal workers and whatever. And I think once you're talking at that scale, and I think that is possible over a period of months, but not weeks probably, right, then I think you can start to see what it might really look like to, I mean, one, students have something to plug into there, but two, you have something you can really imagine mobilizing for a kind of struggle, both to protect research and teaching and learning and students, and also to demand new investment, democratization, a new social purpose for the university that we have not actually been able to. That's a fight we've not actually been able to wage yet, and we have to.
Will?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to add. I mean, in Minnesota, at the University of Minnesota, we've seen a really big upsurge in the in unionization. The graduate students won their first contract in January. The interns at the hospital have just gone through an election and filed for a contract. Um, our AUP chapter has also grown very rapidly in the past year, and I think this is really critical. I mean, I think in a moment, I think it is an example of, you know, an institution that's under tremendous attack, and I think the only way to defend it is for the people who work in the institution to organize and take leadership in ways that, you know, the administration at all of these universities has shown that they're not willing to do. I think it's important to remember that, for example, you know, what happened, you know, people paid a lot of attention to the Harvard administration standing up to the Trump administration, but that only came after the Harvard AUP sued the administration, and that, you know, I think set the tone. So I think we as academic workers really need to do that. I guess I'd also point to healthcare as another industry, and like universities, these are, you know, these are um, split between public and private, but largely dependent upon public money. And I think that makes it, I think we can treat both higher education, well, and secondary education certainly as public institutions, whether they're actually, you know, formally public or private.
Well, what's also interesting is the overlap between higher ed and healthcare
Yeah,
increasingly. I
yeah,
mean, Rutgers, University of California, they sort of do teaching on the side and run medical centers.
yeah.
So I think that's a really important point. You know, there's been a couple things in the chat about, you know, how do we move union members that are pro-Trump, and some things about, variety of those kinds of questions, or these are the same things we've been saying for years. And those are all really good points. I guess I think what the difference is now, it hasn't happened yet, and in the article I talk about it, will start to roll out, is there's going to be material impact on all sorts of people that hasn't happened in the past, which is things are getting cut that people care about. We all have, I have relatives that were going to be that were getting in a, that are sick, and we're going to get in a, one of those tests, experimental programs that was paid for by NIH. They just found out that they're cut off. All sorts of people are having these experiences every day. And I think part of what we have to do, and I think somebody said this earlier, is when those kinds of things happen, those are all opportunities to educate and move people into action. Some people are more upset about the cuts to the national parks than anything else. So we have to be really thoughtful about where the things they're doing engage peoples and groupings and constituencies that normally aren't necessarily excited about what we're doing. And I think one of the places that's going to happen more and more is in the financialization of healthcare. As we have healthcare institutions go down the toilet while the owners are getting rich. What was the one up in Massachusetts? I'm spacing on the name. The hospital chain that they were all flying around in their private jets, and there wasn't even adequate medicine in them. So I think those are all really good examples of how we have to think about where we lean in and take advantage of that Stewart. Thank you, Bruce, for saying that, Stewart Hospital System. So I think these are all really important things because, right, we have to build a bigger base. We have to get more people involved. And part of that's going to be because I think somebody said it earlier, the Trumps and the Musk have such a narrow view of the world. They really think people like what they're doing. And and we should acknowledge, we didn't say it on the call yet, the recent polling is very bad for Trump and that group. Musk has gone from the national hero to being disliked by the majority of the country. That didn't just happen by magic. It's both a consequence of what he did, but a lot of people doing a lot of work to expose, who he really is. So I think that I am really optimistic, which is always my theme, I apologize, about the ability to move folks who we think aren't movable, because they more and more are going to experience the downside of what's coming. And that includes white workers, that includes all sorts of workers who thought they were, and even in my own family, we have a side of the family that's all Venezuelan who were pro-Trump, and they've totally shifted now that they're finding out that they were not the model immigrants that would be allowed to stay. So I think we should be really, really focused on who's getting impacted, and then how do we connect them to our work in a way that really gets us much bigger and stronger for the fight that we need.
Thank you, Stephen. And talking about your Venezuelan part of your family raises the question of immigrants. And to this point, we haven't spent too much time talking about that part of the story right now. So in addition to, everything else about tomorrow, it will be the 19th anniversary of the largest immigrant rights protest in U.S. history, one of the largest protests, and maybe until tomorrow, the largest May Day protest that ever happened in the U.S. The immigrant rights protest from May 1, 2006. The immigrant question right now is really pressing. It was key to Trump's whole agenda, of course. Just from what I've seen, we do some training at the Kalmanovitz Initiative of workers in an OSHA-funded program, actually, worker safety trainings for people in the food industry, all in Spanish. A lot of people are afraid to come even to trainings right now. And so the protests tomorrow, unlike 2006, there seems to be a pall of fear that hangs across many of the communities now. And I wonder how you all see the question of the immigrant issue, immigrant rights, being central to what's happening right now and to the fight going forward. Would anyone like to speak to that?
I guess I'll start just by saying I think immigration is not the only issue, but maybe the premier political issue where we have had absolutely no leadership from the Democratic Party, from our political representatives, right, who have chased the Republicans rightward and rightward and rightward on it, which has, I think, been extremely consequential in the shape of the larger political debate, both about immigration and more generally than that, since it has sort of assumed the place of, Trump's most powerful weapon. I do think that, I don't know if folks saw today in this vein that Hakeem Jeffries was advising Democrats stop going to El Salvador. That's not the issue we want to be talking about. And I think that's a tremendous error. Right, the extreme overreach of the administration, in trying to just illegally disappear people, more or less, does create an opportunity for us to generate, it's one of the many opportunities in this moment where we can actually start to generate a counter narrative about the place of immigrants in our society. And, Stephen brought up polling. In fact, a large majority of the public thinks that Abrego Garcia was wrongly deported. Again, it's going to be our movements that have to say that, because I don't think we can rely, with some exceptions, I don't think we can rely on political representatives to say that for us. But while that's, again, scary, it's also an opportunity to kind of try to break out of the political cycle that we've been locked in, at least since Obama, in some ways since Clinton, of Democrats chasing Republicans rightward. I think now is the moment to really try to confront that dynamic.
And just one minor point that I don't know if other folks have noticed, but the building trades have actually been far out there in defending him. He was a sheet metal apprentice, and the sheet metal workers and others are out there. And I think that it just shows something that, it's a cliche, but when it becomes personal and real, it feels very different. This was a brother. They knew him. He was an apprentice. He was on his way in the building trades. For those who know the apprenticeship program, when you come out, you have a really, really good job. And so I think that those kinds of opportunities, and also, because I have so many people say the same thing, well, we need to be careful in immigration. if they get away on, I mean, we all know what they're doing. They start with one group of immigrants, then they move to green card holders, then they're going to move to denaturalization. And, and so who knows what they're going to move to. So I think it's also a practical thing. It's not just ideologically, and it's moral and it's right. And, I have one daughter-in-law who's Venezuelan and one who's, Ukrainian. So it's like very real to me. But on the other hand, it's also just totally logical and smart that we go against things that ultimately, if they succeed, are going to come after all of us. Again, these all sound like cliches and so obvious, but it's so clear that that's what we have to do. And I was so excited when I saw the sheet metal workers and other building trades stepping out on this in a way that I wouldn't have imagined. I was surprised and I spent years as the organizing director for the building trades. And so I was sort of stunned and excited about that.
Mm.
Yeah, the only thing I would add on this point is I think it just flags I think was a real tragic error on the part of the labor movement in the last 20 years of kind of highlighting that our threat was globalization. And because it wasn't about globalization, a global economy is not the threat. It's corporate power, it's corporate financialization, it's the ability of corporations to pit workers against one another. And I think that just really set up the unions to pit workers from other countries as a threat, as the enemy, when in fact, you can move from Detroit to Alabama and you still lose your job. It's not about globalization, it's about corporate power. And so I think there's a lot of educational work to do, that deep misunderstandings within unions about, why we've seen job loss, why people feel insecure about their jobs, who even is an immigrant, how this works. And so, I worked on a project last year on democracy defense, doing trainings with unions, and just found, a lot of misinformation. But, stuff that can be educated, you can do the work quickly and help people understand, a different way to understand what immigration means and how we are all linked globally. So, I do think it's going to take a bit of an investment, but we have to do it.
Mm.
I just want to add that I think, just echo a few points. I think the repression, this is the most intense, repression that we're facing, that, the immigration, the deportations, and the incredible fear that it's it's demobilizing people, and it's not allowing people to participate in actions, and it's really potentially devastating. I think it's particularly important that in that context that people who have citizenship stand up and take the lead and put themselves out and and defend people, I think. And I think it's really, I had the same response to Stephen to seeing the building trades take up the issue of Abrego Garcia. And I think, I guess I would say that it's these kinds of really bold, stark contradictions, I remember riding the train. I was riding the train before the November election, and these two Latino guys were sitting next to me, like on opposite sides of me, yelling at each other. And they were talking about why they were going to vote for Trump, because he's a businessman and he knows how to get the economy going. And this one guy said, "Yeah, and they're going to deport my whole family, but I'm still voting for him." And I was kind of, shocked. But I think that, when it actually comes to, when push comes to shove and people see their colleagues and their friends facing this type of repression, I think, it offers an opportunity for the labor movement to actually take the right position. And we're starting to see that in a way that is optimistic.
Real quickly, Will, you triggered a thought for me, which is, for years, the right wing has said, we should run the government like a business. And we're now finding out what it's like to run the government like a business. You lay people off with no notice. And I think there's something to tease out, when we were talking earlier about what our vision for the future is, what we're trying to win. It's a very important moment to say, yep, they're in charge and look what they're doing. Not only are they doing cruel things, they're also incompetent. And, to remind people, Trump did bankrupt his company multiple times. Like whenever Trump talks about making America great again, I want to say, let's go to Atlantic City and see what it looks like when Trump's made something great again. So I think there's so many opportunities out there and so many different groupings of people. And I want to go back to what somebody said earlier. It's like, how do we have lots of different things happening, but then how do we connect them? And that's where the magic happens, when you have fights locally, and then we do the work and the research. And that's another thing we need to do lots of, to show how the fights are interconnected, not in in sort of an abstract way, but in a real concrete way. And that by joining people from different states and different sectors together, that's how we go after the folks who are really driving this and profiting from it.
Thank you. I apologize to so many people in the chat and who've submitted questions. I haven't been able to get to so many of them because the discussion has been so organic and rich and flowing. We're almost at the end of our time, but I want to give everybody a chance to have some final words. And what I'd like to ask you all is, as we look forward to tomorrow, a historic number of protests are going to happen, over 1,300, as Stephen said, in every state in the
And
country.
Puerto Rico.
And Puerto Rico as well. This is going to be a historic moment. I'd like to ask you in your final comments to reflect on what is your fear about tomorrow and in the coming days, because I think there are real, things to be confronted, obstacles. One of them is alluded to by a couple of questions in the chat, which have to do with the 2026 election. How do we prevent this energy from being co-opted into, simply a political campaign to take back the House, although for sure that has to happen. I'm not saying you should respond to that, but what is a fear that you have about this moment? What is your hope that that we'll see coming out of tomorrow in the coming days? So with that, I'll open the floor to whoever'd like to speak first.
Start. My fear is that, like the Iraq War protests, for example, we're just in the streets and then we're gone and it doesn't accumulate into anything more. And I think the protest on its own, that is all that it will be. I think the crucial thing for us is to try to keep track of everyone from our community, our organization, our workplace who goes, and to then be talking to them afterward about what that meant to be there and what they got out of that and what it made them see, and to really try to make that the larger coalition that we're going to get a glimpse of, to make it a little bit more real for each participant so that we can summon it again and again and again on a larger and larger scale. And I do think this goes to the kind of question about our vision. What is our vision, our positive, democratic, transformative vision? That's not something that we can just pull out of a hat. That's something we have to create, iteratively through actions like this one, and then talking with one another about what those actions meant. So I think to try to kind of bottle the feeling that we get out of being in the streets together tomorrow, and actually, try to share that with one another the day after tomorrow, is really important to do, so that it's not just a kind of flash in the pan.
Okay.
I just want to clarify, HJ, just globalization. Yes, I would call that capitalism. Capitalism has been damaging to the West. A global economy can be democratic and fair. So I understand that what your point is there. But anyways, my fear is also the same as Gabe's, that we have a one-day thing. So I would say specifically, if you're in a union, sign up your union to be an organizational partner to the May Day events. There's a plan to keep that work going. And so that is a place to do. I'll put that in the chat. Also, if you're in a union, get your national leadership to engage in labor for democracy. There's a plan to do more with that with the international level. I would say study the Minnesota case study, learn what they did there, and then plan.
Which we posted. We posted the Minnesota case study.
Yeah, right, in the chat. Go see the case study in the chat, and then plan like a day school. Bring together unions and base building organizations in your community where you're studying the Minnesota model, how to do shared research, how to do shared long-term planning, how to do strike schools, and so forth. And then I would say, yeah, just be prepared to take it up a notch and think about what is going to be the next level of escalation after May Day, whatever happens tomorrow. My fear is, you know, that we won't be creative. We can't just keep doing rallies where the police, you know, coordinate where we're going to walk and where we can go. We need to be creative about what the next action looks like.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Well, I think it's telling we all have the same fear. I guess I think to the uprisings of 2020, and I feel, you know, that we saw this massive uprising that I think was explicitly rejected the task of building lasting organizations, and I think we were left with an uprising that was very fleeting, and we saw a very fast and ferocious backlash against it that really it had no ability to counter. And that's my fear. I think, and that's why I really emphasize, you know, if you're not in a union, find one and build one. And, you know, and protect yourself and your coworkers and give yourself that structure that you can actually continue and build something sustainable.
So I agree with
Thank you.
everybody. My biggest fear is that it's a flash in the pan and we go home. And so I think it's our duty, it's our challenge, it's our mission to plan the escalation. We are going to plan the week after, I think on the 8th, another national call for people to debrief it, to start building out something here. And so I think that the real challenge for us is to take this with a level of seriousness that we're able to think that we have to do multiple things at once. There's not one simple answer, and we have to move them, and each of us have a different role in doing that. But I think this is, I guess what I would end with, because I know we're out of time, is that we need to look at this, I think, where we started. We have to do the defense, but the sooner we can get into the offense, the sooner we can start articulating what we're fighting for, the sooner we can point at who the people are that are in charge of doing all these terrible things. The more we can do that, the more we can build organization and the kind of things we need. And the final thing I'd just say is we need to be ready to be incredibly nimble. Things are moving very quickly. We have no idea what happens next. We don't know when the Insurrection Act is called. We don't know what wackiness they're going to do. And so I look at tomorrow as really almost a practice run on what we can do very quickly to be in it. And I think we have to analyze, where are these 800 places? There's demos in places I've never heard of. And so I think a big fear I would have is we have all these actions and we don't capture the human beings, we don't capture the energy, because something's building out there. And it's shame on us if we can't figure out how to turn this into a movement that not just rebuilds the labor movement, but builds the kind of justice movement we need. And as I ended the paper with, that we need to get out of the trap of saying, well, what can we win? And we need to get back to what we used to all be about, which is we're trying to get to the promised land. We're trying to get to a much better place. We're trying to get to a place that's worth fighting and dying for. And if we can't articulate that and inspire people, then why would anybody want to take the risks that are ahead if all we're about doing is trying to go backwards to what was unacceptable in the past?
Well, what a great way to end. This has been a remarkable discussion. The thing that gives me the most hope is that we're at a moment where discussions like this are happening organically around us. And tonight we had a really high level consideration of the problem and the opportunity that we now face. And thank you all for joining us. We will make the recording of this available that you can share with folks you think might be interested and can learn from it. We welcome your participation in the events of tomorrow, and want to thank my panelists, Alexis, our friends in these times, and well, let's get out there tomorrow and make this happen. Thanks, everybody.
Take care. Thank you.